Hello everyone, I'm Andrea from Andrea Flipping Unique. Welcome back to my channel, and if you are new here, thanks for joining. So I would imagine that you're looking at this dresser right now and questioning my sanity, and I would not blame you because it's pretty horrendous. However, I am a sucker for previously painted vintage and antique furniture. So when I saw this on Facebook Marketplace listed for free and that it was on the curb, I knew I had to go grab it and try to save it before it ended up in the city dump. So continue watching and see if I was able to. So the first thing I did after wiping it down was remove these handles. They were actually stuck on here pretty good, and some of them I really had to yank off. And I'll show you here in just a minute, but the amount of paint that was built up on the back of these things completely blew my mind. So after I took all the handles off, I took the drawers out and I numbered them, which actually later on served me no purpose, and you'll see why. And then some of the drawers on the back side had all of this liner on it, and I don't know what was up with this either, but I took it off and then cleaned them up. I also went ahead and removed the few drawer stoppers that were left. I should have removed the tacks as well, but I didn't do it until after I started sanding, and I'm not really quite sure why, but I'm going to assume that I got distracted doing something, so next time just do it all at the same time. Then I started to scrape the paint off. And if you are wondering why I am not using stripper, I don't like stripper, I hate the mess, and I try not to use a lot of chemicals, so my carbide scraper is my go-to. I already knew that this trim piece was not in very good condition. There were tons of missing wood from the backside. There's all of these holes here that you can see. There was chunks missing on some parts, so I really wasn't too concerned about being gentle with taking the paint off because I had already had it in my mind at this point that I was going to cover up all of that detail anyway. So curiosity got the best of me, and I quickly moved from the trim piece to the top because I was so curious as to what was happening underneath this paint. I knew the waterfall section of this veneer was not in good condition because I could tell just from underneath the paint that it was cracked, but I was really curious if the top of it was good. So it was about right here where I realized, okay, I might be able to salvage some of this. I was also fairly surprised how easy this paint did come off. And I will say, please wear a mask when you're using your carbide scraper as well, because even though it's not sanding, it still does create a lot of dust. When I finished removing the paint from the wood trim and the top, I decided to grab my orbital sander and 120 grit sandpaper and start tackling the inside of this dresser. Looking back at it now, I still don't understand how some of this paint got into the areas that it did. I went back to using my carbide scraper, except for this time it was the sides of the dresser, and the paint on the sides was a little bit more difficult to remove than anywhere else, but just like the top of the dresser, I discovered that the veneer underneath was in pretty good condition. One thing I did do shortly after this was go and sharpen the blade on my carbide scraper because I realized that was part of my problem is it got really dull. So just keep in mind that these blades can be sharpened and you don't have to buy a new one every time. The last thing I had to do with my carbide scraper was to tackle these drawer fronts. And just like everything else, these two were covered with paint. So you want to be really careful when using a carbide scraper on veneer drawer fronts like this around the edges because you can accidentally rip your veneer off or cause tear out if you're not going with the grain. So around the perimeters of the drawers, I try to go in a diagonal motion to avoid doing that. So another tip that I want to share with you all, and I learned this the hard way last year, I think, is when you're dealing with painted pieces on veneer drawer fronts like this, you want to establish early which way your grain pattern is going. So on these drawer fronts, the grain was actually running vertically up and down as opposed to horizontally, which most drawer fronts typically go that way. So I had to make sure that I was running my scraper vertically and not horizontally, because if I was doing it horizontally, I would have caused tear out against that grain. So if you're not used to using a carbide scraper, or you are unsure of which way your grain pattern is going, then I definitely would recommend grabbing some stripper at this point and just taking the paint off that way. After all the paint was finally off, I grabbed my orbital sander and 120 grit sandpaper and removed the rest of the finish. Shortly after this is when I realized that numbering the drawers at the very beginning was pointless, because these drawers had to go back in a specific order because they were veneered from one big giant sheet, and if they were out of order, it would have looked really strange. You can also see, as I'm sanding this drawer front in particular, the ghosting that's happening on the top of it. There was a sticker, or I don't know if it was a sticker, but I'm assuming it was original to the dresser. But as I was scraping the paint off, the sticker was also crumbling off with it. So I had no choice but to remove it, but it did leave some ghosting behind, which I was able to cover up later on. I also went ahead and sanded all of the paint that was underneath the drawers and the top of the drawers and the sides of the drawers. After sanding everything with 120 grit sandpaper, I discovered I was still left with areas that had paint stuck in the grain, so I decided to use some acetone and steel wool and a wire brush and try to scrub all of that paint out. I like to put my acetone on some steel wool and then kind of scrub the area, and then I'll go in with my bristle brush if it's still not lifting, and just continue that process until all of the paint comes out. And when you are using acetone, make sure you're wearing the proper PPE, and that means correct gloves and eyewear and a mask, because this stuff is really toxic. I managed to remove about 99% of the paint that was stuck in the grain on the drawer fronts, but this top was a completely different problem. I had done 2 rounds of acetone on this top, and I came to the conclusion that this paint was just not coming out, and I was going to end up having to paint it. So after accepting defeat, I decided to move on and get some wood epoxy putty and fill in some areas on the drawer fronts that were missing. If you're not familiar with what wood epoxy putty is, it's a 2-part system that you mix together, and it has resin and a hardener, and people use it to fill in hardware holes. I like to use it to do veneer repair on. But the key to this is you want to make sure that you slice it and not pinch it off, because if you pinch it off, you could run into the issue of not getting the correct ratio to allow it to cure properly. So after you slice your piece off, you're going to want to squish it in between your fingers till it forms one uniform color, and then you can place it wherever your repair is. Make sure when you are working with this that you're wearing gloves, because this stuff is toxic and it can cause skin irritation. So you can see on this drawer front right here that I do have a chunk of veneer missing. So I'm just going to take my putty and kind of squish it in there and just have it be slightly above the veneer itself. And that way when it dries and I go to sand it down, everything will be completely flush. You can also mold this stuff, so I actually took some in between my fingers and the palm of my hand and made these little snakes so that I could fill these holes in better. And I did the same thing. I just had it slightly above the veneer, so when it was dry, I just sanded everything down flush. While I was waiting for my putty to dry, I decided to tackle these handles, and they were a disaster. So I put them in a pot of water, enough to just cover them, and I added about 3 tablespoons of baking soda, brought it to a boil, and just kind of let them marinate there for a little bit. And I want to give a special shout out to my friend Illuminae at Just Keep Sanding, because she is the one that suggested this to me, and I'm glad she did because this paint melted right off. I knew that these handles were brass, so after I got all the paint off, I did take some Barkeeper's Friend and steel wool and scrub them to get all of that tarnish off. I also wanted to modernize the base a little bit, so I decided to cut out the middle section, and I did that with my jigsaw, and then I just sanded everything down smooth with my orbital sander. I still needed to address all of the issues that this wooden frame had, and one of the issues was right here on the trim. There was a huge piece of wood missing. I knew I had to bondo it, but I wanted to make sure that the bondo would be secure on there, so I attached these little nails and I hit them down so that they were just slightly lower than the highest point of that trim. That way when I put the bondo on, it had something to grip to. After I finished with the nails, I went and mixed up some bondo, and if you haven't seen my short about mixing bondo, you're not supposed to be mixing it on cardboard. The bondo can soak up contaminants that are in the cardboard, and the cardboard can actually soak up the hardener and resins that are in the bondo, both causing it to not cure properly. They suggest using a non-porous surface such as glass, metal, or plastic, and in this case I'm using a silicone mat that I got, and what's great about this is once the bondo is dried, it just peels right off. I know this is going to make a lot of people upset, but I did end up filling in all of this detail. Reason being, there was so much damage to a lot of these areas that time-wise it just didn't make sense for me to try to fix it all with everything else that I had to do with this piece. I sanded the bondo down with 80 grit sandpaper after it had dried, and there were a couple of spots on this piece that I had to do 2 rounds because there were some holes. This is the area that I had hammered in those nails, and I also will say this is the first time using my sanding attachment on my multi-tool, and I love this thing so much. Prior to this clip, I had stained and top coated these drawer fronts, and I did not like how they turned out. It wasn't necessarily a bad color, it was just hiding the natural colors that were in this wood grain because this stain in particular is semi-transparent. This was also the first time that I was using my new dust extractor that I had purchased from Harbor Freight, and I absolutely love this thing. So if you're looking for a more affordable alternative to the Surf Prep or the Festool, this is a great option. So remember when I said I accepted defeat and decided that I was just going to paint the top of this dresser? Well, I ended up doing one more round of acetone, and I was able to get enough of the paint out that when the wood was wet, it actually blended into the natural color. So I decided that I wasn't going to paint it. I was still painting the front of the waterfall, however, because there was a lot of damage on that, and time-wise, it would have taken me days to just fix that area. So I ended up making a stencil out of some leftover drawer liner, and I cut out some half circles and made a scallop design. I ended up marking where the center of my dresser was and lining it up with the middle of one of the circles. That way my design would start in the middle and be even on either side, and then I just traced everything with my pencil. I do want to note that I normally use primer on my pieces, but I didn't on this one, and reason being is I already knew there was going to be at least 2 or 3 layers of paint on this piece, and I didn't want to add additional layers and make such a difference between where the paint was and where the wood was. but I use Behr Dynasty, and painting that on raw wood does have a really good adhesion anyway, so I was okay with just doing that. And if you were wondering why I didn't just take the stencil that I had made and used it as a sticker stencil, that's because it wasn't long enough and I didn't want to sacrifice my really good liner just to do a whole stencil, so I ended up painting it by hand. After I did my first coat of paint, I went and sanded everything with 400 grit sandpaper, and this just ensures that I get a really good smooth finish. I ended up doing a total of 3 thin coats of the black paint, and then I went in with 1 coat of water-based polyurethane and satin on only the black. I wanted this piece to be a little bit different, so instead of doing the satin on all of the piece, I chose to do a matte water-based polyurethane on just the veneer. I applied it using this small detail brush on the areas that were right next to the black, and then I went in with my foam roller and applied the rest. I still tried to be really careful about not getting any of this top coat on the black section, but the good thing about having the satin down first is if I did, I could just wipe it away. I ended up doing 3 coats of the matte water-based polyurethane, and in between those coats, I sanded down with 2000 grit sandpaper. You can also use a paper bag. After all of the veneer was top coated, including the drawer fronts, I then went in with 1 last coat of polyurethane on the black, but this time I added paint to it. Sometimes when you add top coat on top of your paint, it can tend to look streaky or almost foggy, especially on dark colors, so adding paint to your top coat will help you get a more cohesive, flawless finish. I don't have an exact measurement to give you to do this because I pretty much just eyeball everything, but I add enough to just tint the top coat. I didn't do this on my first round of top coat because I wanted to make sure the matte top coat was down first. That way, if I accidentally got this on the wood veneer, I was just able to wipe it away instead of having to worry about sanding it. So the last big thing that I had to do was color match all of the veneer repair that I made, and I like to use this kit from Bondcart. You can get it on Amazon, but it comes with all kinds of wood colors along with the primary colors, so I'm able to mix anything that I need to. You also don't have to have a special sealer with these, so you can just paint your layer, let it dry, and then paint right on top of it. One thing I will note about these pastes is they do tend to dry fast, so I work with a really small amount at a time and just kind of lay my colors up that I think I'm going to need, and then just mix a little bit at a time. And if I do see that they're drying out, I'll actually load my paintbrush with some water and mix it into the paste, and that will help keep it wet for a little bit longer. Walnut veneer, which is what this is, has a lot of different colors and tones to it. So when I'm starting off my color matching, I like to start off with a dark base and then gradually add lighter layers of color on top of it until everything is blended and seamless. So a couple of things that I like to do to get the most realistic veneer repair is after I'm done color matching, I'll take a small X-Acto knife, and where I painted on the paste, I'll start making little nicks and scratches to mimic the grain. If the grain on the original veneer is dark in color like it is here, then I'll take it one step further and I'll actually water down a little bit of dark paste, paint it over those nicks and scratches that I made, and then wipe it away. What's supposed to happen is the watered down paste is going to get trapped in those nicks and scratches that you made. So if you find that nothing is being left in there, then go ahead and make your scratches a little bit deeper and then repeat the process again. So I didn't say this in the beginning, but my main goal for this dresser for myself was to only use products and supplies that I had on hand. I had this liner left over from a different dresser, and looking at the roll, I thought I had enough, so I started cutting out my pieces, only to realize I had enough for 3 of the drawers. So instead of ordering a whole new roll, which is what I said I didn't want to do, I went back into my stash and I found this liner that I've had for a couple of years, and when I measured it out, I had just enough to cover the other 2 drawers with 1 inch to spare, so I thought it was fate. Some of you are probably going to look at this and think it clashes really bad, but I oddly think it goes together. So I ended up doing every other drawer. I put the handles back on, I waxed them, and I just called it a day. And last but not least, I had to put the drawer stoppers back in and the tacks. I did have to break my own rules and purchase the drawer stoppers because the dresser was missing all but 3 of them, and in order for the drawers to fit properly, they had to be installed. These tacks I had on hand. I tried them out with the drawer. I didn't like the way they fit. It made the drawer sit up too high, so I did go back to the original ones. Before I show you all what the dresser looks like now, I wanted to remind you of what it looked like before. And if you want to see more furniture flips, restorations, tips, and tricks, then be sure to subscribe to my channel. And this is how it turned out. I am so extremely proud of this piece. I'm glad that I was able to save it from the landfill. I'm glad that I was able to salvage as much of the veneer as I could and the original hardware. So the question for you is, would you have picked this up and tried to salvage it yourself? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for being here, and I will see you next time.